key card stopped working at 11:47 in the morning. Marcus Webb discovered this not at the front door, not at the elevator, but at the small side entrance he had used every single day for 17 years, the one near the loading dock that smelled faintly of coffee grounds and printer toner, the one he had chosen deliberately because it meant he could arrive early without passing through the lobby, without small talk, without performance. He pressed the card against the reader the way he always did, with the back of his knuckle rather than his fingertips, a small habit he had never once examined, and the light blinked red. He pressed it again. Red. He stepped back, looked at the card as though it might offer an explanation, and then stood there for a moment in the thin November air with his coat not yet buttoned and his breath visible in small, dissolving clouds. Around him, the city moved the way cities always move at that hour, without interest, without pause, and Marcus Webb, 51 years old, father of one, 17-year employee of Caldwell Consulting Group, understood in the wordless, cellular way that men understand things they are not ready to say out loud, that something had already ended. He had been in the building 2 hours earlier. He had sat in the large glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, the one they used for client presentations and quarterly reviews, the one with the long mahogany table that was too formal for the conversations that actually mattered, and he had listened to the new CEO, a man named Daniel Hurst, deliver what Hurst clearly believed was an inspiring address. Hurst was 42, Yale undergraduate, Harvard Business School, previously a VP at a consulting firm in Boston that had been acquired and dissolved inside of 3 years, though no one in the room appeared to find that detail worth mentioning. He had the particular confidence of a man who had always been told he was exceptional and had simply never accumulated enough evidence to the contrary. He wore his suits the way certain men wear certainty, as though the alternative had never seriously occurred to him. He stood at the head of the table with one hand in his pocket and spoke about transformation. He spoke about agility. He spoke about the firm's need to evolve beyond what he called, and here he paused, as though the phrase had weight, legacy dependency. Marcus had heard that phrase before. He had, in fact, written a cautionary note about it in an internal memo 3 years earlier, a memo that had been read by 2 people and filed somewhere beneath the accumulated sediment of institutional indifference. He said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table, the way he always sat in rooms where he had learned that speaking changed nothing, and he listened. Hurst explained the restructuring with the brisk generosity of a man delivering good news he expects to be thanked for. The firm was bringing in a specialized team. 5 consultants, each a credentialed expert in a distinct discipline. Organizational behavior, systems design, leadership development, performance metrics, change management. 5 people, 5 salaries, 5 sets of business cards with the Caldwell logo that Marcus had watched go through 4 redesigns. They would, Hurst said, bring the firm into alignment with current best practice. They would replace what he called another pause, another wait, the generalist model. No one looked at Marcus when Hurst said this. That was the part he would carry longest. Not the words, not even the decision, but the careful, deliberate way that 11 people in that room found 11 different things to look at in the moment that the sentence landed. Pen, a phone screen, the middle distance, the window. His colleague of 9 years, a man named Paul Travers who had eaten lunch with Marcus no fewer than 300 times, appeared to find something of consuming interest in the grain of the mahogany table. Marcus understood this too. He understood it the way you understand whether not with anger, but with the quiet, tired recognition of a pattern you have seen before. People do not look at the thing they are part of. It is easier that way, costs less. He did not make a scene. This was not because he lacked feeling. He had, in the elevator down, a moment so sharp and so private that he pressed his thumb hard into his palm just to have something to press against. But because making a scene had never once been available to him as a luxury. He was a single father. He had learned, in the years since Lily was 7 years old and the world had rearranged itself without asking his permission, that falling apart was something you scheduled, if you did it at all. You did it at night, after homework was checked and lunches were made and the apartment was quiet and there was no one left to hold together except yourself. You did not do it in elevators. You did not do it in lobbies. You especially did not do it in glass-walled conference rooms in front of men who had already decided what you were worth and were simply waiting for you to agree. So he took the cardboard box they had left on his desk, and he noticed, with a precision that would have been funny under different circumstances, that someone had already placed it there before the meeting, which meant the decision had been made before he walked into the room, which meant the meeting had not been a conversation but a notification, and he carried it down 14 floors and he walked to the side entrance near the loading dock, and he pressed his key card against the reader, with the back of his knuckle, and the light blinked red. He stood there for a long moment. Then he buttoned his coat, tucked the box under his arm, and walked to his car. On the passenger seat, visible through the window, was a drawing Lily had made when she was 9 years old. A crayon portrait of a man at a desk, labeled in large, uneven letters, "My dad, the smartest one." He had carried it with him for 12 years. It had never once been wrong. There is a particular kind of man who does not talk about what he carries. You have met him, or you have been him, or you have stood beside him for years without fully understanding what was happening beneath the surface of his ordinary face. He shows up on time. He does the work. He does not complain about the wait because complaining requires an audience, and somewhere along the way he stopped expecting one. Marcus Webb was this kind of man, and he had become this kind of man not through philosophy or discipline but through necessity, through the specific, irreversible education of loss arriving before you were prepared to receive it. His wife, Caroline, died on a Tuesday in October, 14 years ago. A truck ran a red light on a wet road 3 blocks from the grocery store where she had gone to buy apple juice and the particular brand of crackers that Lily, then 7 years old, refused to eat any substitute for. Marcus learned about the accident from a police officer who stood at his front door with his hat in his hands and the careful, practiced expression of a person delivering information they wish they did not have. Lily was at school. She was in the middle of a spelling test. She spelled family correctly that day, with the small, satisfied confidence of a child who does not yet know that the word is about to change its meaning. Marcus did not take bereavement leave. He took 3 days because 3 days was what the policy allowed and because he had not yet developed the particular wisdom of knowing when policies do not apply to you. On the 4th day he returned to Caldwell Consulting, sat at his desk, and began building the training framework that would, over the next 17 years, become the quiet skeleton of everything the firm knew how to do. He did this not because he was unfeeling but because he was a father, and fathers in his position do not have the option of stopping. Lily needed school fees and winter coats and someone to sit with her at the kitchen table while she cried about things that were not really about the thing she was crying about. She needed a person who was still standing. So Marcus stood. He had joined Caldwell 11 years before Caroline died, in a junior training coordinator role that paid modestly and asked very little of him creatively. But Marcus had a particular gift. Not the kind that announces itself, not the kind that fills rooms or wins arguments, but the kind that works in the background, invisibly and without credit, making complex things simple and broken things functional. He understood how people learned. He understood the specific architecture of competence, how skill was not transmitted through PowerPoint slides or motivational slogans but through carefully sequenced experience, through the right challenge at the right moment, through making a person feel capable before asking them to be. He built training programs the way a watchmaker builds a movement, with the understanding that every component exists in relationship to every other component, and that beauty in such things is never decorative. It is structural. He wrote the onboarding manual. He redesigned the leadership development curriculum 3 times, each time without being asked, each time because he could see exactly where the previous version was failing and could not in good conscience walk past a problem he knew how to solve. He created the performance coaching model that the firm's senior partners used in client engagements without, it should be noted, any particular awareness of who had designed it or why it worked. His name appeared in none of the external materials. He had never requested that it did. This was not humility in the performing sense. It was not the strategic modesty of a man waiting to be discovered. It was simply that Marcus had never fully believed that credit was the point. The point was the work. The point was that it functioned. He did all of this while raising Lily alone. He packed her lunches at 5 in the morning because the evenings belonged to homework and the nights belonged to whatever she needed them to be. He attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every awkward, fluorescent-lit awards ceremony in a gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and collective hope. He learned to braid hair from a YouTube video when Lily was 9 and wanted braids for picture day. And he practiced on a throw pillow for 2 weeks beforehand because he was not willing to do it badly. He was not a perfect father. He was too quiet sometimes, too internal, occasionally so absorbed in a problem he was solving in his mind that he answered questions Lily hadn't asked, but he was present. Completely, deliberately, stubbornly present. That was what no one at Caldwell had ever thought to put in a performance review. That the man who built their systems had been building something else at the same time. Something far more difficult, far more important, and entirely without institutional recognition. And that he had never once asked them to notice. Daniel Hurst was not a cruel man. This is important to understand. Cruelty would have been simpler, easier to name, easier to resist, easier to carry without it leaving a mark. Cruelty has edges. You can see it coming and brace for it and afterward point to the place where it landed. What Daniel Hurst was something harder to argue with and considerably more common. He was a man who had confused momentum with vision, and who had spent enough years being rewarded for that confusion that he had lost the ability to tell the difference. He moved fast. He made decisions. He spoke in the language of progress and optimization and strategic alignment, and because that language sounds like intelligence to people who have not yet learned to listen beneath it, rooms tended to move in the direction he pointed. This was his talent. It was genuine. It was also, in the specific way of certain genuine talents, dangerous in the hands of someone who did not know its limits. He had arrived at Caldwell 4 months before the restructuring, brought in by the board after 2 consecutive quarters of flat growth, and the particular institutional anxiety that flat growth produces in people who have never learned to distinguish a plateau from a foundation. Hurst's brief was modernization. His interpretation of that brief was essentially replacement of systems, of structures, and of the people most associated with them. He had done this before. In Boston, at the firm that had since dissolved, he had restructured a team of 12 down to 4, brought in external talent, and produced 18 months of impressive metrics before the underlying architecture, the institutional knowledge, the relational infrastructure, the quiet accumulated competence of the people he had removed, collapsed under the weight of its own absence. He had left before the collapse became visible. This was not cynicism on his part. He simply moved at a pace that kept him ahead of consequences. At Caldwell, he looked at Marcus Webb the way a man looks at furniture he has inherited, not with dislike exactly, but with the particular impatience of someone who already knows what they want the room to look like and cannot yet see how the existing pieces fit. Marcus did not present well in meetings. He did not use the vocabulary that signals ambition to people fluent in ambition. He answered questions directly, without preamble, without the performance of considering that makes answers seem more considered. He did not volunteer opinions unless asked, did not position himself, did not remind people of his contributions in the casual, strategic way that certain colleagues had refined into something almost invisible. In the 4 months Hurst had been at Caldwell before the restructuring, Marcus and he had spoken directly perhaps 6 times. Hurst had found these conversations efficient and unmemorable. What Hurst had not done, what he was constitutionally, perhaps professionally, perhaps simply too busy to do, was look at what Marcus had actually built. He had read the summary documents. He had reviewed the training budget. He had seen the org chart and noted Marcus's position on it, mid-level, unglamorous, the kind of role that tends to disappear first in a restructuring because it lacks the visibility to defend itself. He had not opened the curriculum frameworks. He had not traced the performance coaching model back to its origin. He had not asked, with any real curiosity, why Caldwell's onboarding retention rate was 14 points above the industry average, or why new hires at the firm consistently reported feeling prepared rather than overwhelmed, or why a mid-sized consulting firm with no particular reputation for talent development had, quietly and without fanfare, produced 6 team leads in 3 years who had gone on to senior positions at firms twice Caldwell's size. These were not questions Hurst thought to ask because they were questions about something that was working, and his orientation was toward things that were not. The 5 specialists he hired were individually excellent. This too is important. They were not unqualified, not incompetent, not the cynical hires of a man covering his tracks. They had credentials and expertise and the specific, polished confidence of people who had been trained, formally, institutionally, with careful documentation and recognized methodology, in exactly the disciplines Marcus had spent 17 years mastering through practice, failure, revision, and the kind of accumulated judgment that does not appear on a resume because there is no certificate for it. What none of them knew, what Hurst did not know, what no one in the building knew except Marcus himself, was that 3 of the 5 specialists had been trained using frameworks that Marcus had written. Not inspired by, not similar to, written, word by word, system by system, years before any of them had heard of Caldwell Consulting. The room had replaced the architect with people who had studied his blueprints in school. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 weeks after Marcus left. It did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived the way structural problems always arrive, quietly in the margins, in the small functional failures that people mistake for isolated incidents until there are enough of them to form a pattern. The new onboarding cohort, the first to go through the restructured program designed by the 5 specialists, completed their 3rd week with a disorientation rate that the HR coordinator described in an internal email as unusual. New hires were technically trained but operationally lost. They knew the vocabulary but not the sequence. They could define the firm's methodology in a presentation but could not apply it under the mild, ordinary pressure of a client call. They had been given knowledge without the architecture that made knowledge usable, and the difference, invisible in a classroom, devastatingly visible in practice, was exactly the difference Marcus had spent 17 years designing out of the system. Paul Travers, who had found the mahogany table so interesting on the day of the restructuring, was now the de facto institutional memory for a team that did not know it needed one. He fielded questions he could not fully answer. He forwarded emails to people who forwarded them back. He searched the shared drive for documents that turned out to exist only in a folder structure Marcus had built and maintained personally, organized with a logic so specific and so quietly intuitive that no one had ever thought to document it because no one had ever imagined it would need to be reconstructed from scratch. 3 times in the first month, Paul picked up his phone to call Marcus, and 3 times he put it back down because the call felt like an admission he was not ready to make. The specialists, to their credit, worked hard. They were not lazy or careless. They were simply operating without the substructure that gave their expertise a foundation to stand on. The organizational behavior consultant redesigned the team structure without knowing that Marcus had already tried that configuration in 2019 and documented exactly why it created communication bottlenecks in cross-functional projects. The systems design specialist built a new performance tracking model that was, Marcus would have recognized immediately, a more technically sophisticated version of a model he had retired 4 years earlier after identifying a fundamental measurement bias in how it handled qualitative outcomes. The leadership development consultant introduced a coaching framework that was, in its core principles, so similar to Marcus's original curriculum that 2 senior partners independently mentioned, in separate conversations, that it reminded them of something, though neither could say exactly what. It was Lily who first understood the scale of what her father had built. She was 21 now, studying organizational psychology at a state university 2 hours away, and she had come home for a long weekend in the month after the dismissal to find her father quieter than usual. Not broken, not bitter, but contained in the specific way of a person who has absorbed something large and has not yet decided what to do with it. She sat with him at the kitchen table the way she had sat with him since she was 7 years old, and she asked him to explain what he had done at Caldwell. Not what his job title was. Not what department he worked in. What he had actually done. He talked for 2 hours. He was not a man who talked easily about his own work. He had always been more comfortable doing than describing. But Lily asked the right questions, the precise, structurally curious questions of someone who had been studying the science behind what her father had been practicing intuitively for nearly 2 decades, and something in him responded to being genuinely asked. He described the curriculum architecture. He explained the sequencing logic, why certain skills had to be developed in a specific order, why challenge had to arrive before consolidation, why the relationship between trainer and learner was itself a system that needed to be designed rather than assumed. He pulled out notebooks, actual paper notebooks, filled with handwriting so small and so dense that Lily had to lean in to read them, containing frameworks, iterations, failure analyses, revision notes, and in the margins occasionally, small calculations that turned out to be Lily's school fee deadlines, grocery budgets, and once, poignantly, a reminder to buy poster board for a science project. His work and his fatherhood were written in the same notebooks, in the same margins, in the same handwriting, as though, for 17 years, the 2 things had never been separate because they hadn't been. Both required the same fundamental skill, the ability to take something fragile and unformed, understand exactly what it needed to become, and build the precise conditions in which that becoming was possible. Lily closed the last notebook and sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, with the calm certainty of someone who has just understood something important, "Dad, they don't know who wrote what they're teaching." The call came on a Wednesday morning, 9 weeks after the key card stopped working. Marcus was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a freelance proposal he was not particularly interested in writing, for a company he was not particularly interested in working with because the kind of work they were asking for was a thinner, more transactional version of the work he actually knew how to do, and he had reached the age where the distance between what he was capable of and what people were willing to recognize him for had become, on certain mornings, physically uncomfortable to sit with. He answered the call because he did not recognize the number, and in the particular economy of a man between engagements, unrecognized numbers retain a hopefulness that familiar ones have long since exhausted. It was a woman named Sandra Okafor. She introduced herself as the head of talent development at a firm called Meridian Group, a name Marcus recognized as one of Caldwell's mid-sized competitors, the kind of firm that had always been competent without being distinguished, solid without being remarkable. She was calling, she said, because she had come across his name in an unexpected place. One of the 5 specialists Hearst had hired, the leadership development consultant, a man named Greg Fallow, had, in a professional development seminar 3 weeks earlier, presented a coaching framework as the foundation of his methodology. A colleague of Sandra's had attended that seminar. That colleague had also, some years earlier, attended a conference at which a paper was presented on competency-based learning architecture in consulting environments. The paper had been authored by a researcher at a Midwestern university who had, in her methodology section, cited an unpublished internal training document from Caldwell Consulting Group as the source framework for her empirical model. The document was dated 11 years earlier. The author listed was Marcus Webb. Sandra had spent 2 days tracing the thread. What she found was not a single document but a lineage, a quiet, uncredited genealogy of ideas that ran from Marcus's notebooks through internal Caldwell materials, through academic citations, through the syllabi of 2 professional certification programs, and out the other side into the polished, credentialed presentations of specialists who had learned the principles in classrooms without ever learning the name of the man who had worked them out at a kitchen table at 5 in the morning, while a child slept in the next room. His frameworks had been cited, adapted, built upon, and formalized by people who had received them at 2 or 3 removes and had no reason to trace them further back. The ideas had traveled. Marcus had not. He listened to all of this without speaking. Sandra asked carefully whether he was currently engaged with another firm. He said he was not. She asked whether he would be willing to meet. He said he would think about it. He thanked her, ended the call, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time with his coffee going cold and the freelance proposal still open in front of him, unread. He was not triumphant. This is the part that is easy to misunderstand about men like Marcus. The reversal, when it comes, does not feel like victory. It feels like something more complicated and considerably more quiet. It felt like standing in a room where the lights have finally been turned on and discovering that the furniture was always where you thought it was, that your sense of the space had always been accurate, that the darkness was the only thing that had ever been wrong. It felt like confirmation of something he had never stopped believing and had never quite been able to prove, delivered at a moment when the need to prove it had already cost him more than he would have chosen to spend. He thought about Lily. He thought about the notebooks in the drawer, 17 years of mornings, 17 years of problems worked out in small, dense handwriting beside grocery lists and school fee reminders. He thought about the photograph on the passenger seat. My dad. The smartest one. She had made that drawing at 9 years old with the absolute, unqualified confidence of someone who has not yet learned that the world grades on credentials rather than contribution. She had simply looked at her father and written down what she saw. He thought about Daniel Hearst, somewhere on the 14th floor of a building Marcus could no longer enter, managing a restructured team that was slowly, quietly, unmistakably coming apart at the seams he had spent 17 years stitching together. He did not feel anger. He had carried the anger already, in the elevator, in the parking lot, in the weeks of 2 quiet evenings that followed. What he felt now was something older and steadier. He picked up the phone and called Lily. The meeting with Sandra Okafor lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Marcus had prepared for 1 hour. He brought nothing, no portfolio, no slide deck, no printed resume with its careful architecture of dates and titles and the particular institutional grammar that makes a career legible to strangers. He brought himself, which is what he had always brought and which had always been, in the rooms that noticed, more than enough. Sandra had done her research. She came with printed copies of 3 papers that cited his work, a timeline she had reconstructed from publication dates and document metadata, and a quiet, precise intensity that Marcus recognized immediately as the professional signature of someone who genuinely understood what they were looking at. She showed him the lineage she had traced. Seeing it laid out, the citations, the adaptations, the institutional pathways through which his frameworks had traveled without him, produced in Marcus a feeling he had not anticipated and could not immediately name. It was not pride exactly, though pride was somewhere in it. It was closer to the feeling of having told a true thing for a long time in a room that wasn't listening, and then discovering that the room had been recording, that the words had gone somewhere, that the work had not, in the end, disappeared into the institutional silence that had always threatened to consume it. It had moved through the world on its own, stripped of his name but not of its structure, not of its function, not of the specific intelligence that had made it work in the first place. Sandra made him an offer, not a consulting contract, a role, a real one, with a title that reflected the scope of what he actually did, with a team he would build rather than inherit, with the explicit mandate to design Meridian's talent development infrastructure from the foundation up. The salary was 30% above what Caldwell had paid him at the end. She slid the offer sheet across the table with the directness of someone who had decided before the meeting that she was not going to be subtle about wanting him, because subtlety had already cost him 17 years of institutional invisibility, and she was not interested in contributing to the pattern. Marcus read it carefully. He read everything carefully. Then he looked up and asked one question: whether he would have the autonomy to build it the way he believed it needed to be built, without the kind of strategic interference that turned good systems into compromised ones. Sandra said yes, and said it in the tone of someone who understood exactly why the question was being asked, which told Marcus more about the culture of the place than any formal answer could have. He said he would give her his answer by Friday. He drove home through the kind of late afternoon light that makes ordinary streets look briefly important, and he called Lily from the car because he had promised to keep her informed and because, in the 17 years since he had become her only parent, the habit of telling her the true things had become structural. Not a choice he made consciously but a feature of how he moved through the world. She listened without interrupting, which she had learned from him, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're going to say yes." It was not a question. He told her he was considering it carefully. She said, "Dad, you've been doing the work without the room for 17 years. Take the room." He accepted on Thursday. He did not wait until Friday because he had already known on the drive home, in the particular way that men who have spent years learning to trust their own judgment eventually learn to stop delaying what they already know. The news reached Caldwell the following week, carried by the specific, efficient channels through which professional information travels in an industry where everyone knows someone who knows someone. Sandra had not announced it publicly. She was not the kind of leader who used other people's stories as content, but the professional world is smaller than it appears, and the connection between Marcus's departure from Caldwell and his arrival at Meridian was not difficult to draw for anyone paying attention. Paul Travers heard about it on a Tuesday. He sat at the mahogany table for a long moment alone in the conference room, and thought about all the lunches and all the things he had understood and had not said, and felt the specific private weight of having been a bystander to something he could see but had chosen not to name. Daniel Hurst heard about it on Wednesday. He asked his assistant to pull Marcus's personnel file. He read it for the first time. Took him 40 minutes. When he finished, he closed the folder, set it on his desk, and looked out the window at the city that moved the way cities always move, without interest, without pause, and said nothing to anyone for the rest of the afternoon. On his first day at Meridian, Marcus arrived through the front door. This was not a statement. He had not planned it, had not rehearsed it, had not stood in front of a mirror that morning deciding what it meant. He simply arrived at the building, walked to the entrance nearest the parking lot, and found that it was the front door, a wide glass entrance with a lobby that had natural light and a receptionist who said good morning and meant it, and he walked through it without the long habit of avoidance that had shaped his mornings for 17 years. It was such a small thing. He noticed it only later, in the elevator, and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was tight. His office was modest and adequate and entirely his to arrange. He put nothing on the desk the first day except the notebooks. 17 years of them, stacked in the order he had written them, the earliest ones soft and warped at the corners, the handwriting in the first volume slightly younger looking, slightly less economical, still developing the compression that came with time and practice and the specific discipline of a person who does important work in the margins of other important work. He sat in front of them for a while before opening his laptop, not because he was sentimental or not only because he was sentimental, but because they were the evidence, not of his career, of his life, of the fact that the two things had always been the same thing, carried in the same hands, written in the same notebooks, built in the same early morning hours while the city was still dark and Lily was still sleeping and the work was just the work, quiet and necessary and entirely without audience. Lily drove down that weekend. She arrived Saturday morning with coffee from the place he liked, which she had remembered without being reminded, which is the particular grace of children who have been paying attention. They sat at the kitchen table, their kitchen table, the one with the slight wobble on the left side that Marcus had fixed 3 times without fully resolving, the one that had held 17 years of homework and school projects and late dinners and early mornings, and she asked him how it felt. He thought about it carefully before answering, because he was a man who preferred accurate answers to easy ones. He said, like the work was always the right size. I just wasn't in the right room. Lily nodded. She understood this immediately, in the way that children of quiet men learn to understand the compressed, precise things their fathers say, not by translating them but by already knowing the language. She had grown up inside his particular way of seeing the world, had absorbed his orientation toward function over performance, toward accuracy over impression, toward the patient, unglamorous work of building things that actually worked. These were not lessons he had taught her explicitly. They were lessons she had learned by watching, by proximity, by 17 years of 5 a.m. mornings and packed lunches and braided hair and notebooks on kitchen tables. By being raised by someone who treated the ordinary work of a life with the same seriousness and the same care that he brought to everything else. She reached into her bag and placed something on the table between them. It was a drawing, the original, the crayon portrait from when she was 9, slightly faded now, the paper soft with age. She had been keeping it. She had taken it from the car sometime in the weeks after the dismissal without telling him, because she had worried he would look at it during the difficult weeks and feel the distance between what it said and what the world appeared to currently believe, and she had wanted to give it back to him at the right moment. This was the right moment. He looked at it for a long time. My dad. The smartest one. The letters still large and uneven and absolutely certain. The figure at the desk still recognizable, still leaning slightly forward in the posture of a man who was thinking, the crayon desk covered in crayon papers, a small crayon window behind him showing a crayon sun. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, and this was not, finally, a sad moment. It was the opposite of a sad moment, though it contained sadness the way all true things contain everything they have passed through to become themselves. He picked up the drawing and propped it against the coffee cup. Then he opened his notebook to a fresh page, uncapped his pen, and began to write. The work was waiting. It had always been waiting. And for the first time in 17 years, the room was finally the right size.